You may have heard of an emergency fund, but have you ever heard of an emergency budget? An emergency fund is typically our first layer of protection in case of an emergency. The typical recommendation is to have 3 to 6 months worth of expenses in an emergency fund in a high interest savings account. This cash, this liquidity helps buffer against larger emergencies. But in a very large emergency, we might want to have a second layer of protection. An emergency budget offers that second layer of protection. So in case of a large emergency like a job loss, a disability, a health emergency, or if you're in retirement, it could be a large recession or depression, or it could be a period of high inflation. During large emergencies like this, we might want to have a second layer of protection, and that could be an emergency budget. Now, an emergency budget is exactly what it sounds like. An emergency budget is a reduced or pared down budget that you can put in place during an emergency to reduce outgoing cash flow. An emergency budget is typically 10, 20, or 30% less than your existing budget. It might have certain things removed, things that you wouldn't be able to do without for a long period of time, but for a short period of time during an emergency, you'd be willing to give up to get yourself back on track. The nice thing about an emergency budget is it can help extend an emergency fund even further. So if you have a 6-month emergency fund, an emergency budget paired on top could actually extend that emergency fund even longer, maybe 8-9 months. So an emergency budget is typically 10, 20, or 30% less than your typical budget, your normal budget. And this is different for everybody. So depending on your existing expenses, you might look at different reductions in spending for your emergency budget. So everybody's a little bit different, but I'll give you an example of what we would do in an emergency budget in an emergency situation. So our emergency budget has a couple of different reductions. One, we would look at reducing any sort of non-employer matched savings. So for example, we would reduce and delay our RESP contributions, knowing that we can still get the government grant later by making catch-up contributions. Now, the second thing we would do is we would look at reducing entertainment and travel spending. So we reduce those to 0. We'd look at no spend alternatives. Now, the third thing we would do is we would reduce and delay home maintenance expenditures or find DIY alternatives. Now, the fourth thing we would do is we would reduce our food costs. We'd look at being a little bit more deliberate with our food budget. And then the fifth thing that we would do is we would also look at going carless. So we have one vehicle, we'd potentially go down to 0. If you have 2 vehicles, you might go down to 1, but we would look at public transit, walking, biking to work instead. So everybody's going to be a little bit different, but by having an emergency budget in place in advance, it helps provide additional peace of mind. It's the second layer of protection if you were to face an extremely large emergency. So emergency fund, first layer of protection, but your emergency budget can add a second layer of protection if you face a very large emergency. Thank you for watching, and again, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the little bell icon notification to get notified when there's new videos. We're coming out with a new video every week. Thanks again.